So after doing the last exposure test on Kodak's Ektar 100, I've been curious about what I could do next. And so far throughout these tests, the one thing I've learned is that when it comes to professional color negative film stocks, they're all pretty forgiving. But I've been pretty curious for a while now how some of the cheaper negative film stocks on the market would hold up. So recently I got my hands on some Lomography color negative 400. And I figured it's probably the perfect film stock to test out next. So today we're going to run this film through the same style of tests that we've done in the past, and then we're going to take a look at the results at the end of the video. And if you haven't seen the previous tests, definitely check them out, but I will compare some of the previous results with these when we take a look at the end. So let's go. Okay, so for anyone who watched the Ektar exposure video, this one's going to be very, very similar. Pretty much exact same setup out here in the backyard, Yashica Mat 124G. The only thing is the light today, it is sunny out, but there are a ton of clouds, so it's going in and out of the clouds, super inconsistent. The sun just ducked behind them right now. So I'll show you the setup, but basically gonna have to just wait here until I get a pocket of sun that comes out and then fire off these frames as quick as possible. I just want that sun out so we can get some contrast and have some deep shadows and some bright highlights for this test, but show you what we're working with here. Okay, so exact same frame as before. Got the Yashica Mat here. Once that sun's out, it'll be a little easier to see the composition just with the shadows that fall in the foreground. Pretty much exact same as the Ektar test, but it'll give us a nice range to look at, you know, some bright highlights in the sky and then some deep shadows just on the shed here in the foreground. Okay, so just wrapped up, managed to get that done in that little brief period of time in between the clouds. So yeah, gonna send the film off and we'll check out the results. Okay, so results are back from the lab, and I gotta say, I'm pretty impressed. And the reason for that is just with this being a cheaper film stock than say a Portra 400, and it can be considered a consumer stock versus say a professional one. And because of that, I just kind of assumed that it was gonna fall apart a lot quicker than say an Ektar or Portra 400H. But as you'll see, that's definitely not the case. So pretty impressive, but let's jump into it. Okay, so first up is the normal exposure, and all looks good here, and I actually quite like the colors of Lomography's color negative films, and I'd only shot their CN 200 up until this point, but I gotta say the 400 looks pretty nice as well. Quite a range of tones in this scene. As you saw when we shot it, it was kind of harsh midday sun, so there's some deep shadows, some bright highlights and stuff like that, but it's gonna serve us well for this test and what we're doing. But let's start by going backwards. We'll jump into the first stop underexposed. So here is one stop under, and first impressions, honestly not that bad. Actually, the colors in the midtones are actually a little bit nicer, a little more saturated, which is expected. Something that probably could be compensated for while editing. The difference isn't huge, but they are nicer. And then the shadow areas actually aren't that bad. You can see that they are starting to get a little bit noisier and a little more flat. But at one stop under, it's still held up pretty well, and I wouldn't say by any means that this is unusable. So not a huge difference from the normal exposure. Okay, so two stops under, and we are seeing quite a big difference here. Similar to what we saw with all the other color negative films that we've tested so far. The shadows are becoming quite flat, pretty noisy, and the image in general is becoming flat overall. For me, in my opinion, two stops under, this is unusable, unless you're kind of going for this look and this is something that you want to do. So one stop under, not bad, still usable. Two stops, just like all the other color negative films, we're seeing quite a drastic change. And then three stops under, more of the same. This is just pushing it pretty far. The shadows are really noisy, really becoming quite flat. Obviously not much information there on the negative. And three stops under, no surprise, I would consider this image definitely unusable. So one stop, not bad, still usable. 2 and 3 as expected, just starting to get a little bit too flat and a little bit too noisy for my likings. Okay, so one stop over, and if we compare this to the normal exposure, honestly, it looks almost identical. we are losing a little bit of saturation in the grass on kind of the midtones highlights, which is to be expected, but again, really, really minor difference and something that could definitely be compensated for while editing afterwards. So yeah, one stop over looks pretty much the same as the normal exposure. Okay, so 2 stops over, and again, not bad at all, very close to the normal exposure. We are losing some of that saturation still in the highlights and the midtones a little bit, and then I am noticing the sky is starting to shift a little bit to magenta, but again, still very, very minor differences that could definitely be corrected while editing afterwards. So yeah, still pretty good here at 2 stops over. Okay, so 3 stops over, and still not bad at all, still very much usable. I am starting to notice a little bit of loss in terms of the punch in the highlights and the midtones. It's becoming a little more flat, which typically is what starts to happen as you start overexposing your film quite a bit. But I feel like at this point, the differences could still very much be compensated for while editing. So yeah, 3 stops over, still not bad at all. Okay, so 4 stops over, heading in the same direction that we were with the last image. Still not bad at all though. I mean, the highlights and midtones are starting to become even more flat. But still at this point, you could still fix this image. The differences aren't massive by any means. And we are talking about 4 stops of overexposure, which you'd really have to be going out of your way to kind of be off this far. So really interesting to see. Obviously 4 stops is extreme, but in my opinion, at 4 stops over, you could still completely use this image and kind of compensate for the differences while editing. So definitely impressed. Okay, so 5 stops, more of the same. Now the image is starting to become a little warmer and still moving in that same direction, starting to get a lot kind of flatter. The highlights and the midtones are really starting to become almost like, I don't know how to describe it, like creamy, losing a lot of their punch and a lot of their brilliance. But again, this is 5 stops of overexposure. This is quite a lot. And again, if you're using a meter, even if you're using your camera's built-in meter, there aren't going to be too many scenarios where you're off by this much and you're overexposing your film by 5 stops. So I think even at 5 stops, if you had to, this image could still be used. Obviously, it's not ideal, but it's not some massive shift where it's standing out a lot compared to the normal exposure. So not the greatest, but I gotta say I'm impressed, and it's still held up pretty well for what it is. Okay, and the last one, this is 6 stops over, and now this is finally getting to the point where I would consider this unusable. But this is very similar to what we saw in the other color negative tests. Usually it was around that 5 stop mark where the image started to become kind of unusable and pushed too far. This one is starting to get really warm, really flat. The highlights are losing a ton of their punch. But again, this is 6 stops of overexposure. This is really kind of extreme. So I would say 6 stops unusable, 5 almost kind of unusable, but you could maybe compensate if you needed to. So looking at these results, I gotta say, I'm pretty impressed. I would say anywhere up to kind of 3 stops of overexposure, you're still kind of in a range where the differences are very minor, and even at 3 stops, you could probably tweak the image to look exactly kind of like the normal exposure. 4 stops still usable. It's not until kind of 5 and 6 where this film starts to get to that point where the differences start to become quite major. But pretty impressed. I mean, again, this is pretty extreme. Even at 3 stops of overexposure, again, if you're off by that much when you're metering, that's quite an extreme difference from the normal exposure. But it is interesting to see that even at 3 stops, this film still holds up really, really well. Even at 4 stops, it's still usable. And if we jump in and just take a look in comparison to some of the other results, but the really interesting thing is when we compare this to Portra, and when we compare it to Ektar, the tests we did with those 2 film stocks, it's almost behaving the exact same way. With those, we saw up to 3 stops, almost no differences, so very similar with the Lomo 400, and then it was kind of at 4 stops where we started to see that shift, but it was still usable, and then 5 and 6 is kind of where things started to fall off to the point where it would be considered unusable. And that's what's really kind of impressed me so much about this test. Like I said at the start, I was just assuming that since this is a cheaper film stock, compared to Portra 400 and Ektar, that it was going to perform not even close to as well. But, from these tests that I've done, it almost behaves in the exact same way. And for me, if I was going to shoot Lomography 400 color negative regularly, I would probably treat it the same way I do as Portra and aim for about a stop of overexposure just for a little more shadow detail. But just nice to know that the film can go 2-3 stops and still be really good, and it's not up until about 4 stops where the highlights really start to kind of lose some of that punch and that brilliance. But overall, kind of not what I was expecting in a good way, and I am pretty impressed. So looking forward to shooting with this film and experimenting with it a little more in the future. But anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this test. If you have any recommendations for some other film stocks you want to see done in the future, let me know. These tests are pretty simple. They're meant just as a way to see how this film would react if you're shooting it and then sending it away to a lab for them to process and scan normally. But really interesting nonetheless, just to see how these film stocks react. So hope you guys enjoyed this. As always, thank you for watching. If you're not following me on Instagram, that's where I post all of my work quite consistently. Link is in the description below, so give that a follow. And until next time, thank you guys. We'll see you soon.